Hello everyone, welcome to another video tutorial on YouTube channel of tutorialspedia.com. In this video tutorial, I will explain step by step how we can implement a RESTful web service using TIBCO BusinessWorks. For this purpose, I will be using TIBCO BusinessWorks REST and JSON plugin. Before I proceed, you are requested to kindly subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed before, so that you are able to get latest videos as and when I upload. So here is the agenda of this video tutorial and the steps that I will be taking during this video tutorial. For this tutorial, I will implement a user management scenario with one RESTful web service, and this RESTful web service will have two operations. There will be one operation based on the post verb to add a new user into the database, and there will be another operation with the get verb to get the details of any user from the database based on the user ID. For this tutorial, I will be using Oracle database in the backend, and all the requests and response will be in the JSON format. So without further ado, let's directly jump into the implementation part. I have already created a TIBCO BW project with the name REST service. So let's start implementation. So for the implementation of this RESTful web services, let me first create the required folder structure. As a best practice, it's always recommended to have proper naming convention followed and proper folder structure created with a proper hierarchy in your project so that you are able to reuse it, and also you are able to find any relevant resources from your project when needed. So I will create one folder with the name shared resources, and within this shared resources folder I will create subfolder for connections, in which I will place JDBC as well as HTTP connection, and I will create another folder for schemas where I will create XML schemas, and I also need a folder for processes where I will implement the processes, and let's create another folder with the name dispatcher where I will have the main dispatcher for my service. So first of all, we need to create the database connection in HTTP connection that we will be using. So I'll go into the shared resources and in the connection folder, and I will create a new JDBC connection. And this JDBC connection will be using Oracle driver. I already have a Oracle Express Edition XE schema running on my machine, so I will use that on the default localhost 1521 port, and the DB schema is XE. I will specify the username and password, and let's test the connection, and it says that JDBC connection test successful. So we are successfully connected to the database, and let's create now our HTTP connection, because the REST web service that we are going to create will be using HTTP connection, as it will be an HTTP based REST service. So let's create HTTP connection from the HTTP palette. And here you have to specify the host and port. Ideally, in the normal real scenarios, you always make sure that you have global variables for these type of connection parameters. But in this simple scenario, I will just hard code the connection with the host as localhost, and port I will use any of the available port. I will use 5675 for now. So this way we have created two connections. Now second thing that we need to create is an XML schema. Based on that, we will have the request and response for our web service. So let's go to XML tools and create schema, and let's name it as user schema, and double click on this, and now here we need to create the required elements of the schema. So we will make it as user elements, and we will define the elements. So for our case, we will have user ID, user name, user status, and let me show you the database table. For this, I have already created a table with the name users, and it has 3 columns: user ID, username, and user status. So accordingly, we have to create these elements. So let's globally create. We can create them locally as well, but for now we will create them globally. And user ID, we will make it optional because it will be automatically generated into the database based on the sequence. So username and status. User status in our database is, let me show you the data types. User ID is number, and username and user status is a string, so we will keep it as is. So this is the schema that we are going to use, a very simple schema. This is not an ideal schema for the real scenarios where we have to create proper request and response structures for each operation. We have to specify other constraints, but in this case we will keep it simple. And next we have to create a dispatcher. So let's go to the dispatcher, and in the dispatcher we are going to create a new process, and let's name it as rest dispatcher. And in this process, the process starter will be a HTTP receiver. So we will go to HTTP palette and we will drop a HTTP receiver. So for this receiver, we have to browse and select the HTTP connection that we have already created. And after that, we need to just add a REST dispatcher from the REST palette. So I'll go to REST and JSON palette, and I will choose REST dispatch and reply. So this REST dispatch and reply will be used to dispatch the request and to call the backend implementation processes. Let me connect them, and now here I will have to choose in the configuration of this REST dispatch and reply. It will be replying for HTTP receiver. And in the service editor, I will be creating the required service and associated resources. So let's add a new REST service, and here I have to specify base URL. So I will specify same as I created in the HTTP connection, localhost 5675 slash rest. Let's make it like this, and this is the base URL. Again, these host name and ports in normal and practical scenarios should be in the global variables, but for simplicity we will keep it like this. Now inside this REST service, we need to add a resource. So the resource that we will be creating, let's make it as user resource, and resource path slash user. Rather, we just create user because it will be automatically as slash. Now within this user resource, we have to add methods. So we will be adding 2 methods, one for get and one for post. The first one that we add, let's name it as the ID of this method, we can write it as user. And since add user will be a post type of verb, so we will choose post for method. And here in the process name, we will have to select a process which has the actual implementation of this operation, and then we will have to bind it, but we did not create yet. So let's go into the processes folder and create a new process. This process, we will name it as add user implementation, and within this process we are going to use JDBC activity. Before that, let's go to the start activity output editor and create a new complex element, rather a simple element of type string, and we will make it as post because we want to pass the post data from the dispatcher to this process. So we will select this post data, and now we will parse this data and then add it into the database. So in order to parse this data using the XST that we already created, we will go to REST and JSON, and we will use this option of parse JSON. So let's connect it, and in this parse JSON schema type XST, and in the input So first we need to specify output editor, and we will select XML element reference, and we will refer to the user schema that we already created, because we expect data to be received from the client side in the JSON format based on this schema. So we selected this, and in the input we need to map this post data to the JSON string. So now this JSON string will be the input, and potential output of this parse JSON will be user ID on optional element, username, and user status. Here we need to click on this validate output to make sure that whenever we pass the values, they are validated and made available to the next subsequent activities. After parsing, now we need to add it into the database. We will simply add a JDBC update activity here, and let's connect this parse JSON to this JDBC update and name it as save user data. And we already created JDBC connection, so we will just select the connection here. And next, in the SQL statement, we will write the statement insert into users, and we will add into two columns, user name and user status, because ID will be generated automatically. Values, and since we want to dynamically pass the values, we will put two question marks here. When we added two question marks, we see here this yellow mark stating that you need to create these prepared parameters. So we need to add two parameters. Let's name these parameters same as the name in the database, user underscore name and user underscore status. So we already created these parameters. So in the input tab, now we need to map the values for these. So whatever we will parse from the JSON, we will map that username to the username and user status to user status. After this, we just want to add simply a response that we will be returning back to the dispatcher. For that purpose, we will not create any fancy type of response. Rather, we will just create a simple response with a message. But again, we want it to be in the JSON format. That's why we will use this render JSON activity. So here in the render JSON, we will specify what kind of response we are sending. So this is for the success scenario whenever the save user data is successful. So here for this, again, we will make sure that we do this validate input, and in the input editor, we will make a complex element with the name response. And I would like to add two sub elements, response code and response message. Response code, and I will make it as integer, and response message, and this one will be string. So in the input, I will just pass response code something like 1 in case of success, and response message data saved successfully. So in this way, whenever we will have successful data saved into the database, we will be passing this one. In the practical scenarios, you also consider the error handling. So in case of error, you pass a different response. But to keep things simple here, I will not have try catch block, and I will not be returning error response. I will be expecting only a happy scenario here. So let's go to the end activity, and here I will be just mapping this response. So element of type and response data, and in the input I will just map this output of render. So this is how we created one process to save the data, and I validated it's successful. Now I need to create another process to uh, get the user. So I will create another process. I will name it as get user implementation, and in the get user case, user will be passing us the JSON form in the request in a query parameter user ID. So accordingly, I need to add a parameter in this sub process with the name user ID, and then I will just simply call the JDBC, use the JDBC query activity to fetch the record from the database. So I will use this JDBC query and I will name it as fetch user data, and I will browse and select the JDBC connection, and here I will, let me first connect it to the start activity. And for this fetch user I will write here select user underscore name, user underscore status from users, where user underscore id is equal to question mark, and I want to get maximum of 1 rows because there should be only one record for a user id. And here I will click on this plus to prepare a parameter, and I will name it as user underscore id, and I will specify it as integer. I will just click on this fetch button to make sure that I created the SQL statement correctly, and then I will have to map this user ID. One change I need to make, user ID here should be integer. Okay, so here I will be getting the response when I'm calling this database using this query, username and user status. I need to return this as a response, and for that I need to go to REST and JSON and use this render JSON activity to render a JSON response. So I will use this render JSON and I will choose this validate input. The input editor, I will click on this plus button and I will refer to the schema that we already created. Choosing XML element reference, I will select the schema. I selected user schema, and in the input now I need to specify the input values. So fetch user result record ID, username for this username and user status for status. Since it requires filter and I need to pick first record, so I will choose filter as 1, and same is for the status. For the user ID, let's simply pass the same user ID that we received in the input. And then this one I would like to map it to the input of the end activity. That's something optional. You can directly refer this one as well in the dispatcher, but just to be on the proper side, I will add a element here with the name response data, and in the input I will choose JSON string and map it to the response data. Now again you are seeing that I'm not adding any error handling here, and I'm only expecting a happy scenario, and if it goes into an unhappy scenario then this process will get aborted, but for the sake of simplicity we will keep it like this. Now we go to REST dispatcher and we will bind these two processes that we created for our service. So for add user, in the process name, I will click on this binocular and I will select the process add user implementation. And now here we have a bind button. I will click on this bind button and I will bind HTTP receiver post data to this one. And for the response, I will have to map the output from the end activity response data to the ASCII content. Another thing I need to do in the header for the content type, I need to specify application slash JSON, because response will be in the JSON format. In a similar way, I need to add another method which will be a get method, and I will name it as get user. And for this one, I will select the second process that I implemented, get user implementation. And for this one, there is one more thing needed. I will have to specify a parameter, query parameter with the name user ID, and I will make it required as true because it's needed, and rather I will make it false because I'm putting both. And in a get user, I will now bind this. So user ID I will select from the query parameter that I am receiving. I need to select this query parameter here as well. I did not specify a query parameter, so I will specify a query parameter as user ID. Now I'll go to this dispatcher, and for this get user, I will bind this user ID from the parameters user ID to user ID. And in the response, I will map the end activity output ASCII content, and also I will specify content type as application slash JSON. So this way we have done the binding for both of these operations. Now let's validate it, and now we can run this process and invoke the operations of this RESTful web service to make sure that both REST and POST operations are working fine. All right, so in order to test this service, let's first load this process in designer tester. I will choose load and start current, and now I will be using soap. I can use soap UI, or I can even use postman as a client. So I will use postman for now, and using postman I will make two calls to this service, one for post operation, another for the rest operation, for the get operation. So I will click on this plus button, and I will specify here for the get operation http colon double slash localhost colon my service is running on port 5675 slash rest slash user, and I need to pass user ID as a parameter. So user ID I will pass as 1 because I already have a user in the database with the user ID 1. So I will just click on this send button, and you can see I received a response with the name user ID is equal to 1, username Ajmal, user status active. You can verify this from the database as well. We have user ID 1, username Ajmal, and user status active. Now let's try to add one user. For that I will click on this plus button, and now I will choose post operation, and I will specify http, let's copy and change, slash user, no need to pass user ID, and I will go to the body. I will choose here raw, and the type will be JSON, and here I will pass username as, let's add uh, Michael, and status inactive. So this is a new user I'm trying to add. I made some mistake in the JSON. So let me just change the name to Michael and status as inactive, and I will try to pass it to the database. So I call the service, and you can see the response. It says that response code is 1 and response message is a data saved successfully. We can verify this by going into the database, and we refresh it, and we can see that we have a new user which has been added into the database with the name Michael and status as inactive. So this is how you create a RESTful web service using TIBCO BW. This REST and JSON plugin by TIBCO is a very handy plugin which saves a lot of time, and you can quickly and very efficiently create your RESTful web services, and you can consume them later, and you can test them using designer tester. So that's it from this tutorial on RESTful web services implementation using TIBCO BW. If you like this video, please comment below, and if you have any questions also, you're welcome to ask in the comment section, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.